They say hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. But what if the truth is quieter and far more uncomfortable? What if some of the most ambitious minds are also the ones that struggle to begin? There is a silent contradiction that rarely gets spoken about. A person who dreams deeply, yet moves slowly, who imagines a future full of success, meaning, and recognition, but finds themselves stuck in stillness, delay, or avoidance. Is it really laziness? Or is something deeper holding the mind in place? Because behind what the world calls lazy, there is often a mind that thinks too much, feels too deeply, and carries a weight no one else can see. This is not about a lack of desire. It's about the quiet war between intention and action. And once that is understood, everything begins to look different. Let's begin.
There is a particular kind of silence that looks like laziness from the outside. A person sitting still, scrolling endlessly, delaying what they once promised themselves they would begin. It appears empty, unmotivated, disconnected. But inside, it is rarely quiet, because what is labeled as lazy is often a mind in constant motion, a mind that replays possibilities, questions outcomes, imagines futures, and quietly collapses under the weight of its own awareness. You may have heard the judgment before. You have so much potential, you're just wasting it. And maybe, on some level, you believed it too. But what if this stillness is not the absence of energy, but the misdirection of it? Because not all inactivity is emptiness. Sometimes it is congestion. Like a river blocked by unseen debris, the flow is still there. It just cannot move forward. There is a hidden intensity in people like this. They feel the future before it happens. They sense the pressure of expectations, both external and internal, long before taking the first step. So instead of moving, they pause. Not because they don't care, but because they care too much about how it unfolds. And in a world that rewards visible action, this invisible struggle becomes easy to misunderstand. What looks like avoidance may actually be overwhelm. What seems like disinterest may be fear disguised as delay. So the question is not, why are they so lazy? But something far quieter and far more honest. What is happening beneath the stillness that no one else can see?
Ambition is often imagined as something loud, a relentless drive, an unstoppable force that wakes early, works tirelessly, and never hesitates. But in reality, ambition is not always visible. Sometimes it is formed in silence, in quiet rooms, in unspoken comparisons, in moments where a person realizes they are not enough, at least not yet. For many who appear lazy, ambition did not grow from confidence. It grew from absence. The absence of validation, the absence of being seen, the subtle feeling of being behind, overlooked, or underestimated. And so, somewhere deep inside, a quiet promise was made. One day, this will be different. But this kind of ambition does not rush. It watches, it absorbs, it waits. It becomes layered with sensitivity, with awareness, with a constant measuring of self against an imagined ideal. And over time, that ambition becomes heavy. Because it is no longer just about wanting something, it becomes about proving something. Proving worth, proving capability, proving that the silence others once placed on them was never accurate. But when ambition is built on this foundation, it carries an invisible pressure. Every goal begins to feel like a test. Every attempt feels like a final judgment. And suddenly, starting is no longer simple. Because it is not just an action anymore, it is a risk. A risk of confirming the very fear that created the ambition in the first place. So the person hesitates. Not because they lack desire, but because their desire has become too meaningful to fail. And when ambition becomes that heavy, stillness begins to feel safer than movement.
There is a point where thinking stops being helpful
and begins to feel like a trap. For those who are called lazy but ambitious, the mind rarely rests. It moves ahead of reality, constructing possibilities, predicting outcomes, rehearsing futures that haven't happened yet. Before a single step is taken, the entire journey has already been imagined. The success, the failure, the judgment, the regret. And somewhere within that mental simulation, something shifts. Because when every possible outcome is seen in advance, action begins to feel unnecessary or even dangerous. Why start if failure has already been experienced in the mind? Why try if the outcome feels uncertain, unstable, imperfect? This is where overthinking quietly transforms into paralysis. Not all hesitation comes from fear of effort. Sometimes it comes from too much awareness, an awareness of flaws, of limitations, of how easily things can fall apart. And then perfection enters the space, a quiet, rigid voice that whispers, "If it cannot be done right, don't do it at all." So the person waits for the perfect moment, the perfect clarity, the perfect version of themselves to arrive. But perfection is a horizon that keeps moving, and the longer they wait, the heavier the starting point becomes. What once required a small step now feels like a leap, and so they return to stillness, not because they are unwilling to act, but because every action has been mentally exhausted before it even begins. The mind, once a tool for imagination, becomes a place of endless rehearsal, and in that rehearsal, nothing ever truly starts.
There is a quiet tension that lives beneath the surface. It does not shout, it does not announce itself, but it is always there, pulling in opposite directions. On one side, there is the vision, a life imagined in detail, meaningful, successful, fulfilled. A version of you that feels real enough to believe in, yet distant enough to feel unreachable. And on the other side, there is the stillness. The delay, the unfinished tasks, the days that pass without movement, even when the intention was clear. And somewhere between these two realities, a conflict begins to form. Because you are not unaware, you see the gap. You feel it. Every time you plan to start and don't. Every time you imagine who you could become and remain where you are. This is where guilt begins to settle in. A quiet, persistent weight. Not loud enough to break you, but heavy enough to follow you through the day. It whispers in small moments. You should be doing more. You're falling behind. What's wrong with you? And over time, this voice becomes familiar, almost automatic. But beneath the guilt, there is something even more fragile. Shame. Because it is no longer just about what you haven't done. It begins to feel like something is wrong with who you are. And that belief changes everything. Because when action feels tied to identity, every step becomes a risk to the self. If you try and fail, it does not feel like a simple mistake. It feels like confirmation. Confirmation that the fear was right all along. So the mind creates distance. Not from ambition, but from the possibility of being proven inadequate. And so you remain in between, not fully moving forward, not fully letting go, just existing in a space where potential and inaction quietly coexist. And the conflict continues, unseen by others, but deeply felt within. There is a question that rarely gets asked. What if this laziness is not a flaw, but a form of protection? Because not all avoidance is weakness. Sometimes it is intelligence, shaped by experience. A quiet system within you, trying to keep something safe. Think about it. If every attempt feels like a test of your worth, if every failure feels final, if every step forward carries the weight of judgment, then hesitation begins to make sense. Because action is no longer neutral. It becomes exposure. Exposure to disappointment, to rejection,
to the possibility that the imagined version of your future may never fully arrive. And so the mind adapts. It slows you down. It distracts you. It keeps you in a space where nothing is proven, but nothing is lost either. This is the hidden function of avoidance. It preserves hope by delaying reality. Because as long as you haven't truly tried, a part of you can still believe, maybe I could have done it if I really wanted to. And strangely, that belief can feel comforting. It keeps the dream intact, untouched, unchallenged. But there is a quiet cost to this protection, because while it shields you from failure, it also distances you from truth, from discovering what you are capable of, from experiencing growth, even if imperfect, from realizing that failure is not the end of identity. Yet the mind does not always seek truth. Sometimes it seeks safety, and so it chooses the familiar discomfort of stillness over the uncertain vulnerability of movement. Not because you are incapable, but because something within you learned that it is safer not to try. And once that pattern forms, it begins to feel like who you are, when in reality, it was only ever something trying to protect you.
There comes a moment, subtle, almost unnoticeable, when something begins to shift. Not in behavior, not in routine, but in understanding. The constant question, why am I like this, starts to lose its sharpness. Because for the first time, the answer no longer feels like blame. It feels like recognition. You begin to see that what you once called laziness was never empty. It was layered. Layered with fear, with pressure, with expectations that were never fully yours, yet deeply carried. And in that realization, something softens. Because it is difficult to hate something once you understand why it exists. The stillness begins to look different, not as a failure of character, but as a pattern shaped over time. A pattern that made sense in a certain context. And this changes the way you see yourself, not as someone who lacks discipline, but as someone who has been carrying too much meaning in every step, too much weight in every attempt. And when everything feels significant, even the smallest action can feel overwhelming. So instead of forcing movement, there is a quiet pause. Not the old kind, filled with avoidance and guilt, but a new kind, one that observes, one that asks without judgment, what am I actually afraid of? What feels at risk if I begin? And in those questions, something deeper reveals itself. Not answers, but awareness. Awareness that the struggle was never about effort alone. It was about protection, about identity, about the fear of losing something invisible, but deeply personal. And once you begin to see that, the narrative slowly changes, from something is wrong with me, to something happened to me. And that shift, however quiet, is where everything begins to open.
There is a gentle kind of change that does not arrive with pressure. It does not demand urgency. It does not insist on transformation overnight. It unfolds slowly, like light entering a room that was never truly dark, only closed. Because once you begin to understand your stillness, something unexpected happens. The need to fight yourself begins to fade. You stop seeing your hesitation as an enemy. You stop treating your pace as a failure. And in that space, something quieter emerges. Permission. Permission to move without proving anything. Permission to begin without needing certainty. Permission to exist in progress rather than perfection. Because perhaps the problem was never that you were not doing enough. Perhaps it was that every action carried too much meaning, too much pressure to define who you are, instead of simply expressing where you are. And when that pressure softens, movement becomes lighter. Not immediate, not dramatic, but real. A small step, taken without the weight of identity, often carries more truth than 1,000 imagined plans. And slowly, something begins to rebuild. Not motivation as the world defines it, loud, forceful, relentless, but a quieter form of alignment, where action is no longer driven by fear, but allowed by understanding. You are not becoming someone new. You are returning to a version of yourself that was never meant to carry so much weight. And in that return, ambition does not disappear. It softens. It becomes something you walk with, instead of something chasing you. If this video made you feel seen, if parts of this reflection felt familiar, if something quiet inside you was touched, then know this: you were never alone in this experience. What looks like laziness on the surface often hides a depth that is rarely understood. A mind that feels deeply, a heart that carries meaning, a person who was never lacking ambition, only overwhelmed by it. And there is nothing broken about that. There is only something that needed to be understood differently. If you'd like to stay connected to this kind of space, a place where we gently explore the hidden corners of the human mind, the quiet patterns, the unspoken struggles, you're always welcome here. And if you feel comfortable, you can share your thoughts below. Not because you have to, but because sometimes a few honest words can help someone else feel a little less alone.